Great, thanks. Glad to be here. I think this is a terrific topic for this event, and so congratulations both to the Federalist Society and to the Classical Liberal Institute, which is a terrific new institute here at the law school, about which we are very excited and thankful for the leadership of both Richard Epstein and Mario Rizzo, who are doing terrific things there. And I think the student leaders of the Federalist Society this year are doing terrific work as well. Bitcoin is a great topic. It's a topic about which I could not know less. And so were it not for the demands on a dean's time, I would stay, and every second spent here, I would be learning a lot. From what I understand, it's possible to use this currency, if that's the right term for it, even anonymously, and that it is far from clear whether it falls under any regulatory authority. Both of those are really interesting, both kind of use questions and regulatory questions. And so how, if at all, law ought to respond to this phenomenon, whether regulation ought to be a goal at all, or whether this is some sort of utopian absence of a regulated currency, I think are very interesting questions that I certainly don't propose to have the answer to. But if it turns out that Bitcoin is here to stay, then I'm sure that before I'm done being dean, I'll be trying to fundraise in Bitcoin. And so I'll come to all of you for answers on how to do that. In the meantime, let me just say thanks again to the panelists and the organizers for being here, and good luck for a great event. Thank you.
Introduction. I thought I would start off. In retrospect, these titles, panel law and regulation, doesn't quite capture the environment you're in with Bitcoin now. It's this strange amalgam of swirling, eddying currents where sometimes what you're grappling with is kind of the public image of Bitcoin. Other times it is the most arcane points of administrative law. I never thought I would have occasion to understand as much about the IRS as I have in this context. And other times it's looking at legislation that might be 40 years old, and you think to yourself, okay, and how are we going to apply this to something that not many people have heard of, let alone understand? And so Bitcoin's law and regulation is some amalgam of those, and sometimes it's more driven by the public image of it. For example, when certain people get arrested for money laundering, or when the federal government shuts down these online bazaars for drugs and weapons. At other times, it is a genuinely good faith effort to understand, okay, we have these existing laws, how exactly should they apply? Or in the case of, if they don't apply, do you need new ones? So there's something about the moment in time where we're in with Bitcoin where you're never going to get all the answers if you just look at the regulation. You're never going to get all the answers if you just look at the underlying law. And you're not going to get all the answers just by sort of running it as a PR exercise, convincing everyone that Bitcoin is great. It's going to have to be some combination of all the three if, as its advocates say, they want to achieve widespread mainstream adoption of this. And we got a great lineup here to talk to you about this. Before we start, I wanted to ask, how many people here have heard of Bitcoin or heard of it before? Okay, I'm hoping, okay, about 100% if you're going to show up, right? How many would say that you understand it? Okay, that is an above average showing for compared to the general population. Let me throw out a few things. How many people read the Newsweek story on the unmasked Satoshi Nakamoto? How many people believed it when they first read it? Oh, no one wants to pony up to that. Maybe Steve Englander. Okay, point. Yeah, there you go. Points for honesty. Okay, all right. They'll be interesting benchmarks. And also, how many people here are students of the law or lawyers? Tech industry, venture capital, finance, a little bit of everything. Okay, all right. That gives us a good sense of who we're talking to. I would like to begin by introducing the panelists. I'll do it one by one rather than get long-winded on this, but we're going to start with Reuben Grinberg from Davis Polk. Take it away.
Thanks so much. So my story with Bitcoin starts in 2011. I was a law student at Yale and had to write a paper. I was sitting in my banking law class looking at the Wikipedia page on money, and there was this link to Bitcoin. And all the link was to this website with just a user forum where, I mean, anyone who didn't have a computer science background could not understand a single word of what people were saying. Thankfully, I have a master's in computer science and worked as a software developer before coming to the law, so I thought it was a great opportunity to try to explain what it was all about. And thankfully, since I've done that, other people have taken up the mantle and have done a much better job than I have, like my panelist sitting to my left here. But what I want to talk about today is just very quickly, I think the compliance and regulatory landscape for businesses in Bitcoin today. And I think the best way to cover this, I think, is if I'm running a Bitcoin business, if I'm about to start one or thinking about starting one, what do I have to worry about? When do I have to worry about it? How much is it going to cost me? What happens if I get it wrong? And who can help me? So let me take those topics very quickly. I know I only have a few minutes here, so I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly. So what do I have to worry about? The number one thing that everyone realizes you have to worry about is anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regimes, both here in the U.S., federal and state level, and abroad. That is because everyone knows that because that's what's been in the news. So Charlie Shrem, one of the former board members of BitInstant and former titan in the Bitcoin industry, who gave the keynote speech at the Inside Bitcoin conference about a year ago, he was recently arrested on participating in a money laundering scheme involving helping out people who were laundering money for Silk Road. Besides that, we also know recently the IRS put out some guidance on taxes last year saying that Bitcoin should be treated as property. Regulatory certainty is great, but there are also a bunch of articles saying we don't know how this is going to work in practice because now every time you spend your Bitcoin, it means it's a taxable event. I think that software developers who have various products out there are just going to have to bake in the tax recording into their software. Aside from those things, there are maybe the securities regimes. I think when I first wrote my paper, I concluded that they weren't a security, and I think that's pretty much been accepted. Even though you won't see a court opinion out there, I think that's pretty much universal. Something that is less accepted is whether the CFTC would consider it a commodity. I think it would. I think probably most people would agree. I think the CFTC would agree too, but the reason it's not under the CFTC's jurisdiction is because the CFTC generally regulates commodities derivatives. So unless you're talking about a derivative on a Bitcoin, then you're not within the CFTC space. And besides that, there are just myriads of laws and rules, both in the state and federal level. And if you're talking about operating abroad, just forget about it. So the interesting thing is you've got people in the early days of Bitcoin and working abroad who say, Bitcoin can't be regulated, or I live here in Canada, or I'm operating in Slovakia, I don't have to worry about U.S. laws, and that's just wrong. We know that if you have U.S. clients, then you have to worry about U.S. laws, and if you don't, eventually you're going to probably end up in jail. So when do I have to worry about it? Immediately. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is if you operate oftentimes a money transmitting license and you fail to register, there can be criminal penalties for that. And in some cases, there are grace periods, but without getting into too much detail, you have to worry about this stuff immediately. And the more important reason is that your business, the way it's run, your cost structure, it's going to be intimately tied up with how you set up your compliance structure, how you deal with these issues, whether it's by having more people or having more software. And if you worry about it until later, you're just going to find you can't run your business. It's just not compatible, and it doesn't make sense to just worry about it until later. How much is it going to cost me? A lot. And I've spoken to some of the largest Bitcoin businesses, and often it's not surprising sometimes for them to be spending a third or even a half of their budgets, of their investment money on compliance issues. And that means money that they've spent on lawyers or on their internal compliance functions. That's a lot of money, and I think probably higher than what you would expect for most startup businesses. And it's just a reflection of the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty in the Bitcoin world on what are the regulations. And it's actually actually very common where there's most uncertainty to have enormous compliance costs. And most of the work that I do is actually not Bitcoin related, but very traditional bank regulatory work. And I do a lot of Volcker work right now. And in part, that's because there's a lot of uncertainty of how to interpret Volcker. And it's just drinking from a fire hose, the questions we get from clients. What happens if I get it wrong? I've already alluded to one of the potential outcomes is you go to jail. But more importantly, and more realistically, you're not going to get any banking relationships. No bank is going to want to work with you, and then it's going to be very difficult for you to grow your business. And then finally, who can help me? I think everyone, as you know, we're here in a law school, so it's obvious that you could turn to a law firm, but also there are consulting firms that can help out with these sorts of things, and it's very specialized firms that look into AML compliance and other areas of compliance. So I think, to focus on this particular issue, that's the, what do I have to worry about? When do I have to worry about it? How much it's going to cost me? What happens if I get it wrong? Who can help me? And then one more point I wanted to make is for those of you who are here who are law students, I think you have a big role to play. I wrote my paper back in 2011, and no one's really, I think, besides Jerry here, really looked more deeply at some of the issues that I brought up because they largely settles those issues. So one example was I looked at, is there any federal law that says you can't make your own currency? I said no, and no one's really cared about it since. And there are some important issues that no one's talked about that may turn out to be a problem. There was a blog post recently saying that if someone is taking Bitcoins as a business, perhaps that Bitcoin is actually property under the UCC, such that a bank that has a relationship with that business would have a security interest in those Bitcoins, even if those Bitcoins are then used by that business further on down the line. And this would create all kinds of havoc. The bottom line is there's a lot of unexplored territory in the Bitcoin legal field, and what would be really helpful is if people like you, who had a lot of time to just sit and think, could write some stuff on it. That'd be great.
I neglected to say that we're going to try to make this as discussion-driven as we can, so panelists will talk for a little bit. Very much want to hear what you want to know about Bitcoin from us, and given the recent Newsweek situation, I'll also try to answer for the sins of the press once all these folks have spoken. So now we're going to go to Jerry Brito of George Mason University, the Mercatus Center. I will give Jerry credit as being one of the leading guys in Washington who has carefully, like you were a 5-year-old child, explained to you what Bitcoin is. That, and very, very patient. Jerry wrote a primer on Bitcoin to sort of walk the policymakers through. And, as a journalist, I'm very grateful to him as a resource, because sometimes I just need to call people and say, explain it to me like I was 5. So, Jerry, explain it to us like we were 5.
Well, thank you so much. And, on that note, if you don't understand what Bitcoin is, please, during a Q&A, raise your hand and we will explain it. I think that we've all of us up here, I think, have worked on Bitcoin for so long where we are sort of anxious to get to some of the next issues related to Bitcoin, and especially Bitcoin policy and the law. And so I think that's what we're all kind of doing up here. But if by the time we're done you still don't understand what Bitcoin is, please stop and ask the question. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is exactly that, is what's next with Bitcoin and law. And I'm taking the opportunity to plug a new paper that we'll soon be publishing. Hopefully, we'll be putting out the draft this week, and then we'll hopefully get a lot of peer review from the smarter folks than us, and publishing it soon. But what we wanted to do with this paper is to say, well, the first application of Bitcoin was basically a alternative to money transfer and to payment systems. And as a result, the first wave of Bitcoin regulation was exactly regulation that fit payment systems and money transfer. So that's AML, KYC, that is consumer protection, that sort of thing. So we've looked at that already. So what's next? What are the next applications of Bitcoin, and therefore what will be the next wave of Bitcoin regulations? And so we looked at basically financial regulation of Bitcoin, right? So we looked at Bitcoin derivatives and Bitcoin-backed securities. We also looked at Bitcoin-denominated instruments, which is an amazing thing that exists, and you have markets and exchanges for instruments that are Bitcoin-denominated that are operating today seemingly under the radar and unregulated, so we look at that. But today I want to briefly sort of talk to you about prediction markets, which I think illustrate well the challenge that Bitcoin poses to policymakers, right? So prediction markets, for those of you who don't know, are basically exchanges where individuals trade what are known as event contracts, which specify some future event with different possible outcomes, a payment structure based on the outcome, and a contract expiration date, and that date is when the payment happens. So for example, you could have a contract that says Hillary Clinton will win the US presidential election in 2016, and it will pay out $10 if the event happens, and it will pay out $0 if the event doesn't happen. And then you could trade this contract, and it, depending on what you think, you could either buy it or short it. And it could trade. So if it trades for $5.50, then we all know there's a 55% chance that Hillary Clinton will win the election. So obviously, what this does is it allows people to bet on the result of the event. But more importantly, what it does is that it aggregates the belief of all the market participants in order to forecast the odds of actual event occurring, and that's very valuable. That's a great positive externality that comes out of this trading. And we can have prediction markets for all sorts of things, right? Or event contracts for all sorts of things. So, in addition to elections, you could do, the Academy Awards or the Super Bowl winners. You could do internal to a company. You could do sales figures. You could do flu trends. So they also tend to be much more accurate than polls and surveys and other sort of forecasting methods because you have something on the line. You're aggregating the wisdom of crowds, but you're doing so with something on the line so that people have incentive to really be accurate, and also incorporate all sorts of information that might not otherwise be available. You could use it, some sort of socially beneficial uses of prediction markets can include forecasting the probability of man-made or natural disasters, predicting political events that could affect financial markets, right? So, such as whether the debt limit will be raised, better forecasting IPO pricing, allowing hedging against the failure of a product, such as entertainment or pharmaceuticals, where you have a lot on the line. So, I guess you can tell I'm a big fan of prediction markets. Unfortunately, in the U.S., the regulatory atmosphere around prediction markets has been pretty hostile. The CFTC has essentially shut down prediction markets in the U.S. Basically, they look at event contracts as commodity options, and so they see them as they need to be traded on regulated exchanges or exempted, and they have permission has not been forthcoming. They shut down the one really big operating futures market, or I should say predictions market, which was called Intrade. They've shut it down in 2012. And since then, they have not given any exemptions or any permissions, right? So you've had other exchanges that have asked to offer, for example, election prediction markets, and that permission has not been forthcoming. So, today, the only real money prediction market that is operating is the Iowa electronic markets, and it's very limited. You only have a small number of people that can trade. The amount that they can trade is very small. So that's sort of a long way of prefacing what prediction markets are. Here's where it gets interesting with Bitcoin. Today you have prediction markets operating online that accept Bitcoin, where the event contracts are denominated in Bitcoin. So for an example of this is something called Predictious. And Predictious likely runs afoul of CFTC regulation. What they are offering are essentially options contracts, and they're not registered with the CFTC or otherwise operating as an exchange. The question, though, is if the CFTC wanted to take action, how do they go about enforcing that rule? You were talking about banking relationships. To the best of my knowledge, Predictious is basically just using Bitcoin as the bank. So there is no bank that you can go and sort of ask as an intermediary to facilitate an enforcement action. There is no payment processor either, right? So when you would use in trade, you would either use a bank wire transfer, maybe you would use your credit card. Here, there is none of that. You're just basically using Bitcoin. So enforcement is going to be very difficult. You also have something called BTC Oracle, which allows you, basically it's binary options on the price of Bitcoin. So you can bet on the future price of Bitcoin using Bitcoin, which is kind of a weird thing, but it's doable. And the way it works is there isn't even necessarily a website. They do have a website, but you don't have to use a website. Essentially, you can just send Bitcoins to a particular Bitcoin address controlled by BTC Oracle, and depending on whether you're right or wrong about your guess as to the future price of Bitcoin, you're going to get back more or less Bitcoins than you sent. And so even if you were to seize the domain and take away the website, it does nothing to the underlying service. You can continue to speculate in these binary options using Bitcoin. And eventually, we're going to see completely decentralized prediction markets, so that there is no website. In fact, there is no company. There are just going to be counterparties finding each other and being able to bet on just about any kind of event, an earthquake, the price of Google, political events. And I just don't know what the CFTC or any other regulator is going to do about that, because enforcing that really can only be done against the individuals. And it's going to be very, very difficult. So my hope is that rather than attempt to fight a losing battle, that policymakers will sort of choose to normalize these prediction markets. And what I'm talking about, this challenge, this is what people talk about when they say Bitcoin can't be regulated. Of course, Bitcoin, the protocol can't be regulated, but intermediaries can. Absolutely they can. And they are. The question is, when you can't get a hold of those intermediaries, or you can't enforce it against those intermediaries, or when you are increasingly disintermediated so that there is nobody that you can go after. This is going to be a challenge, I think, for regulators in prediction markets, in gambling, and in all sorts of other areas. I'll stop there, and thank you.
I'm going to move the order slightly because Brian Klein, yes, you, is of Baker Marquart, the law firm of Baker Marquart, knows law enforcement, but he also works with the Bitcoin Foundation, and I think that will be a nice segue then into John's talk about the U.S. Congress. But sure. Brian, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me. I actually went to law school here, and it's nice to be back. I never imagined that I would be back at the law school talking about Bitcoin, because when I went here, there was no such thing as Bitcoin. I have just two quick questions before I launch. Who in here actually owns a Bitcoin? A whole one? Any portion, a Satoshi, which is the smallest denomination. Who in here is interested in possibly buying a Bitcoin? Who doesn't own one? All right. You know, if you'd asked this question 6 months ago, a year ago, you wouldn't see any hands, and people would probably even raise their hand about interest. But I think that shows the shift that's happening here. My background is, you know, I went to law school here. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm a former federal prosecutor. And now I help out the Bitcoin Foundation. The foundation is the lead advocacy group for the Bitcoin community. Its goals are to educate and advocate. And most of the major players are members of the foundation. The foundation interacts regularly in Washington, D.C. John's dealt with foundation members. The foundation general counsel testified in front of the Senate. I went last year and spoke with FinCEN. So that's what the foundation does. And just to go to sort of Jerry and Reuben's points, you know, what you're seeing from my perspective, both on the foundation and as a criminal defense attorney, is, you know, for a while, and I think it's still true, if you put the word Bitcoin in front of something, you get a press story. So if you sell your Tesla or a Lamborghini, or you indict somebody in Florida for transferring a few $1,000s, you get a press release. And you get Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal or someone to cover that. And from the law enforcement perspective, there's nothing law enforcement officials, they like other things, but they love to get attention for what they're doing. And I think what we're going to see coming forward are more prosecutions. A lot of the early adopters, when there weren't a lot of rules and there was sort of this vacuum that Jerry and Reuben talked about, you know, there was this era where it wasn't clear what Bitcoin was or what applied to it. And now we've slowly seen an era of enforcement. And the dean actually was incredibly wrong. I mean, when he got up there and said, I think it's anonymous and there's no regulation. That couldn't be farther from the truth, either of those things. But I think that's the popular perception. It's not anonymous, and it's heavily regulated even now today. And that's why you're seeing law enforcement actions, because law enforcement's concerned. FinCEN's concerned that Bitcoin can be used to finance terrorism or narco traffic. And the concern is based on, just because not everyone here maybe is familiar with Bitcoin, essentially Bitcoin is gold with a teleporter, okay? So you can move value from here to anywhere in the world essentially instantly. And so, as you can imagine, if you have a nefarious purpose, that can be a very powerful tool. It can also be a powerful tool when you don't have a nefarious purpose. And I think, just to stray from my point a little bit, what Bitcoin's going to hold in the future, setting aside the law enforcement aspect, we're in like 1994 of like Bitcoin versus the internet. I mean, in 1994, I don't even remember the internet. I remember Pine email, okay? There was no Google, there was no Airbnb, there was no Facebook, there was none all of these applications. And Bitcoin at its core is a protocol and a currency that trades on that protocol. But what you're going to see, and I think this is what Jerry's talking about going forward, is the protocol is incredibly powerful. It allows for you to engage in trustless transactions anywhere in the world. And what I mean by trustless transactions, which sounds bad, but it's actually genius, it wipes out intermediaries. You don't have to have an intermediary between you and another party you're dealing with. So, for example, instead of having a bank, like recently I tried to wire money to Brazil to reserve a hotel for the World Cup. That's a total nightmare, let me just tell you. I tried to wire $240. It cost me $40 in wiring fees. Citibank screwed it up. I had to go back and they had to fix it. In Bitcoin, you can do that within 10 minutes, costs you almost nothing, and you can look at the blockchain and verify that. That's the power of Bitcoin today. The power in the future is like Jerry's applications he's talking about. You hear about things like you want to license music, okay? You can layer data on top of Bitcoin transactions in the protocol so that if you're a musician, you could license your music to anyone in the world without using a third party to do that. And I'm not the genius who's going to come up with these applications, or I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be a lawyer. I'd be trying to make money somewhere. But there are people out there today who are thinking about these things. And I think the energy level you see about Bitcoin, and Reuben referred to this, last year there was a conference, and it's being held right now, about Bitcoin. There were 300 people there. It was in a hotel. It was crammed into a lobby or into a small area. This year there's 2,000 people at this conference. There's people in suits and ties. There's professional players who are getting involved. And I'm not just an apologist for Bitcoin, I'm a believer. And I think that's what you're seeing, is that transition from when it was on the fringes to the mainstream. And law enforcement is diving in, venture capitalists are diving in, everyone's diving in. It's an exciting time for Bitcoin, and I think everyone's trying to jump in. That's my spiel.
John Collins is the man on Capitol Hill for Bitcoin. He's a professional staff at the House, at the Senate Government Affairs Committee, and I say safe to say works closely with Senator Tom Carper from across the river in Delaware, and Senator Tom is one of the, well, I think it's safe to say he's the leading member of Congress who's taken a strong interest in Bitcoin, and he's not in the position to make definitive decisions about Bitcoin, but if there's anybody kind of shepherding the process, that would be Senator Carper, and John's his man.
Well, thank you guys for having us today. And I'll just give you a little brief background on sort of what the work that Senator Carper and the committee has done, and then we can probably just turn it over for some of the later conversations. But it was about this time last year that there was a kind of one of these price bubbles in the Bitcoin market, and as Brian just said, anytime you put Bitcoin in a press release, it gets attention. It's a topic that had been on our personal radars for a number of years. But at that point, the committee that I serve and which Senator Carper chairs is the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And so we have two dual roles. One is obviously to manage and conduct oversight of the Homeland Security Department, and then everything else, basically. Jurisdiction over nothing, jurisdiction over everything. And the governmental affairs piece is really focused on sort of how is government collaborating and coordinating on any number of issues. And to us, Bitcoin at that point was clearly something that people were talking about in two ways. One, it's a way to buy drugs on the internet. It's a way that terrorists may or may not be using it. It's a way that criminals are getting away with murder. And then on the other side of the spectrum were folks like Mark Andreessen and others who are saying this is the next internet. It's the biggest game changer in technology since the internet, which is obviously two very different things, one would think, except it's really not. When we've looked back at these conversations that were in Congress at the time that e-commerce was just popping up on the internet. In particular, there was a hearing in 1995, which Mike Castle, who is a longtime congressman from the state of Delaware, actually, held a hearing of a banking committee called the Future of Money. And he was very, very excited about a flashlight that he had bought online and that was delivered to his house via CyberCash, which was a vehicle at that time, which was later bought by VeriSign and later ultimately bought by PayPal. But obviously, and the topic of that hearing was very much a dialogue that we're having about Bitcoin today. There was concern about people who would use it for nefarious purposes, and then folks who really thought that it could facilitate commerce in a very real way. And since that time, we've seen both things happen, but we've found a way to bring value to a marketplace, but at the same time address the risks in a way that makes sense. So what our focus is to really, at that point, no one in Congress had really paid attention to it outside of a few members who had wanted to bring attention to sort of the Silk Road website and what was going on there. But what we aim to do is really kind of cast a really broad net, not only in industry, but in law enforcement and federal regulators to see, what is the level of risk, and at the same time, what is the federal government, if this is the next internet, it's the next big thing that's going to touch all these disparate parts of government, either as a payment rail or as a commodity or both. How is the federal government coordinating, and how are we collaborating to make sure that, because in any sort of government or any sort of office, people have different equities and they will try to grab at things from different ways. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a coordinated response, consistent message coming out of the federal government related to Bitcoin and its treatment. And so that's what we really push regulators to do, and followed, basically just started bringing in agency officials for informal interviews and then formal interviews, sent a round of oversight letters from ourselves and our ranking member, Tom Coburn, to I think 6 relevant federal agencies, asking them where are they on Bitcoin, what's their plan, what are their thoughts, and then followed that up with the first congressional hearing on the topic in November, where we brought, among panelists such as Jerry Brito on the industry side, folks from the Department of Justice, from the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Homeland Security. And the message at that point was, and I think it holds true now, is that we're working on it. We're collaborating through several working groups, not only in the United States, but internationally. Law enforcement, it's a concern. It's a tool that can be used for nefarious ways, but we think at this point we have a handle on it, although we need to remain vigilant, and we want to work with industry to figure out how to do that. And from Treasury and other officials, there's promise here, and we need to figure out a way that we can control it, or at least put some safeguards in place for consumers, but at the same time allow entrepreneurs and folks that want to bring value to the marketplace to do so. Since that time, we've had, the FinCEN guidance was really the first piece of guidance, and for those that aren't familiar with it, that's the Treasury guidance that basically said that, if you're a Bitcoin exchange, they will regulate you at the point of exchange. So at the point in which you exchange your dollar for a Bitcoin or your Bitcoin for a dollar. And if you are an exchange under their guidance, and this is a very simplified version of this, you have to register with FinCEN as a money service business and do all of the anti-money laundering regimes that are required of that, and then register with the individual states, 48 of which, I believe, have money transmitter licenses. And traditional money transmitters are like Western Union, which is a very different thing than a Bitcoin exchange. And that's something we can get into a little later about what's going on, I think, at the state level. And then most recently, the IRS has come out with their guidance defining Bitcoin as property for tax purposes. So at the point we're at with Congress, we're continuing our work. We're working on a majority staff report to sort of bring together sort of our findings related to this issue. And I think as agencies weigh in, it's becoming clearer sort of where the federal government is able to place this technology within the current baskets of regulations that we have. And in our conversations, the role of Congress is, it's, as I think Carter said earlier today, it's very much a reactive organization in ways. We're trying to see with the conversations we have with our constituencies in industry and other places, does that guidance make sense? As what IRS said or Treasury said or other folks said, does that make sense with the current regulations? Is there a need for new regulations perhaps? And that could be the conversation that Congress has over the next year, over the next 2 years. But it's still very much a nascent niche technology that for the most part, there haven't been a whole lot of folks in Congress that have begun paying attention to it, but I suspect that will be changing over the next few years for certain.
Can I just chime in? I mean, I think the one thing that's interested me is I'm never going to get this figured out. I don't know how I bought a Bitcoin if I can't figure out the mic. But from my perspective, it's great what Senator Carper's committee did and is doing in trying to engage in a dialogue. One of the biggest problems, though, is that, for example, the IRS issued guidance without engaging in a dialogue with anybody. So they issued guidance 3 weeks before taxes are due, saying you need to treat this as property. And people have been spending Bitcoins like a currency, buying coffee and pizzas and whatever for the last years, and it's imposed an incredible compliance obligation on people. And I think it's great the Senators Committee is trying to synthesize clear guidance for the community, but the problem is, the left hand and the right hand aren't talking always. I mean, FinCEN says it's a currency and the IRS says it's a property. And it just creates this sort of unknown, and it creates all sorts of headaches, and I'm sure Jerry and Reuben have their own thoughts on that, but to me, the government does need to move quicker and faster because Bitcoin operates at an incredibly fast speed. It's like the internet. Things are moving every day, new things are developing, and waiting 6 months or a year for a report, Bitcoin could radically change in those 6 months to a year, and then they'll be playing catch up again. So I don't know.
Let me just throw a few things out here about, as I said, about the media. Before I do, if you're interested in some resources on Bitcoin, Google Quick Take and Bloomberg and Bitcoin, and you'll come up with a fairly easy sort of thumbnail sketch of Bloomberg, of Bitcoin, complete with some links to our reporting about it. I think it's pretty accessible. I would know because I wrote it. Jerry's primer, I'm sure, little Google, George Mason University, Mercatus Center, Bitcoin primer, there you go, find it easily. And then the paper originally written by Satoshi Nakamoto is shockingly accessible. I was very surprised when I sat down and looked at this. It's not long either. I think it's what, like 10, 15 pages or something, and it's really helpful to your understanding of Bitcoin. When John mentioned that Bitcoin is this thing that is used to launder money, buy drugs, smuggle weapons, and whatnot, usually after that somebody says that, in the next breath it says, the people in the Bitcoin community will say, and that's because the media focuses crazy on the bad aspects of this, or usually they say the mainstream media. Now, I have to confess, I've never been entirely clear on what the mainstream media is. It's mostly a synonym for the media outlet that happens to be pissing me off at the moment. But it's probably safe to say that Bloomberg is a mainstream media outlet. And one notable thing that governs what you see about Bitcoin in the mainstream media is that most of the organizations are pretty large. So just like the federal government, although mercifully not quite as extreme, you have a sort of learning process where reporters, junior editors, senior editors, editors-in-chief, familiarize themselves with the topic at hand and get comfortable addressing the more complex issues in a more nuanced way. I wrote a story for Bloomberg about Bitcoin, which walked through in fairly pedestrian terms how Bitcoin functions as a payment system in a way that's less fraud prone and more efficient than the current payment system. And in the end, it was a very useful exercise internally. I hope some people outside Bloomberg enjoyed reading it, but internally it let me sort of get my footing with the editors and say this is something we need to cover. Another point about Bitcoin coverage that I think sort of accounts for what drives some people nuts about it. Back before the internet, there was a concept in being a foreign correspondent for an American newspaper, or rather being a bad one, which involved reporting from some country, you name it, anywhere in the world, and you take the most extreme element of the society in which you've been plopped, and you take that as typical for that country. And that it's pretty easy to do that with Bitcoin because, frankly, some Bitcoiners say some crazy stuff. The dollar or bygone era of the dollar is a bygone era. Ross Ulbricht, or the guy who ran Silk Road, allegedly, the criminal defense attorney, bragged in an anonymous interview with Forbes about what he was doing. So it's easy to fall into this trap, but I have to say the Bitcoin community preps this trap marvelously every time for the press. You may have seen there was a piece by Kevin Roos, who's a great journalist, in I think it was New York Magazine, entitled "The Doomsday Cult of Bitcoin," and it compared Bitcoin enthusiasts to these end of the world whack jobs from the 1950s, where the end of the world obviously did not come in the 1950s, and so they transformed themselves into a cult with its own sort of internal rituals and whatnot, and just sort of turned in on themselves in crazy fashion. That to me is an example of this kind of questionable journalism where you're taking extreme elements and pushing them as the story of Bitcoin. You got to dig in. It's something you have to do to understand it, and sort of approach the subject in good faith. There's also another thing I wanted to point it out, which I wasn't going to include this, but since we're in the financial capital, I'll throw this out. I was struck by something that the comptroller of the currency, Tom Curry, said. The comptroller of the currency regulates the largest banks in this country, national banks, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, some small ones too, but mostly large. And he had previously been the banking commissioner in Massachusetts. And he's told a Senate committee, it was in the context of JP Morgan Chase, but it could have been anybody. As the commissioner of banks in Massachusetts, I had on the wall a charter for the Bank of Massachusetts signed by John Hancock in 1784. Yes, the guy with the fancy signature. The very last provision of it says that examiners appointed by the Commonwealth shall have full and free access to the books and records of an institution. That is the fundamental cornerstone of our banking supervision in this country for over 200 years. And the reason that jumped out at me in the Bitcoin context was, if you say that to somebody in the tech world, somebody from Silicon Valley, that a basic principle of how this industry is going to work is that federal examiners are allowed to walk into your business at any time they want and have access to any information they want, they'd go silent because they would not know where to begin. The culture of finance and technology could not be more different in this respect. The prototype for a Silicon Valley startup is, you get a couple of people in a room, smart programmers, and they might not bathe for a week. You slide pizzas under the door, and they write the code, and they throw this application up on the web, and people start downloading it. And there are bugs in the system, in the application, and you figure it out along the way and fix them. Imagine a bank that opened its door and said, well, we're going to have bugs. We might lose your money. That'll be just a glitch. We'll work through those things. No, I mean, financial services is never going to work that way. And as I was surprised to learn, it's been like that for 200 years. There's been some measure of federal supervision. So one of the growing pains of Bitcoin has been the coming together. Sometimes it's a clash of cultures. I think right now there's a bit more of an effort of those two cultures to come together to create viable companies. But that is going to rear its head again and again and again, where the tech people say, let's do this. And the financial people say, no, you can't do that. It's going to happen in every company, I guarantee it.
It's mostly lawyers who say, no, you can't.
It's mostly lawyers, yeah, mostly compliance lawyers. Yeah. So finally, Newsweek. I suppose the central question here is, would I have published the Newsweek story? And based on what I know about how they reported this story, I would not have published it. I can't speak for Bloomberg News as a whole, but we have a style book. It's called The Bloomberg Way. And one of the central principles of reporting a story, especially one like that, where you're taking an ostensibly private person and you're thrusting them into the public sphere, is you write down everything, put it all in writing, and tell this person, I am about to publish all this stuff about you in a major national news magazine, and now is the time to tell me if I'm wrong. I may be incorrect in this, but so far nothing I have heard from Newsweek indicates that they did something like that. The story seems to sit on a thin reed of a conversation that the reporter had in the driveway. But you have nothing to lose by going to your subject and laying all out exactly what you want to print. That said, I would write the story if I knew who Satoshi Nakamoto was. I think it's, this person or people came up with a very elegant solution to a long-standing problem in finance of how do you conduct the trustless transaction that Brian referenced. And I'd love to meet the mind that came up with that. It must be some weird combination of, Bill Gates and Thomas Jefferson, a sort of, somebody who can code, but who can also, has a sort of free-ranging mind that can think outside of the box. And a lot of the people in the Bitcoin community got uppity that this person was outed. But earlier today I was talking on a panel about this, and I asked who had actually read the Newsweek story, and virtually every hand in the room goes up because we're insanely curious about this. And one of the main objection that a lot of the Bitcoin community had to writing about this guy was that what really matters is the idea. This is something to chew on at an institution of higher learning. What really matters is the idea, and that the person doesn't matter at all. And to this argument, I have one name to throw out to you, and that is the name of Martin Heidegger. I am by training, a master's degree in European history, which is exactly what you'd expect from someone who covers finance at Bloomberg. But Martin Heidegger was unquestionably a brilliant philosopher, being in time a path-breaking work of 20th century philosophy that influenced a generation, particularly in France. He was also a fervent Nazi. The Nazis made him the rector of Heidelberg University, one of the classical, prestigious university in Germany, where, he presided over the sort of ugly hollowing out of what was once a great institution. And then only recently, in the last couple of months, as Heidegger's endless diaries have been published, do we find in his own hand people him writing very nasty things about Jews. He was an anti-Semite with the best of them. And so my takeaway from the story of Satoshi Nakamoto and Martin Heidegger is that it's very easy in theory to say you only care about the idea. But in practice, once you find out about the person, you might have second thoughts about that. You know, if we find out that Bitcoin was invented by the NSA with the help of the CIA, or if the code was originally written by that hacking unit of the Chinese army, I can guarantee you we're going to end up having a different conversation about Bitcoin than we would before. It's just human nature. So with that, I will shut up. My preference is to go right to questions, but I'm a reporter, so I have plenty of my own that I can throw out. But does anybody in the audience want to kick us off? Don't be shy. Go ahead, and either speak very loudly or mic your way over to a microphone. Okay.
I have a question about small Bitcoin and how you see that moving over time versus something like just a digital dollar currency, meaning that a treasury comes out with a digital dollar, and maybe some country somewhere sees a first mover advantage to being a country that coexists with business and tries to propagate future businesses because it has this very friendly posture towards digital or cryptocurrency.
Jerry, you want to?
I would point out one thing that just last week, Mint Chip, which was the Canadian Mint's attempt at exactly what you're describing, creating a digital a sort of bearer dollar, Canadian dollar, threw in the towel, and they have stopped development on that project. And you mentioned cryptocurrency, and I'm not sure that a state would create a cryptocurrency as we understand the word, which means it's completely decentralized, trustless, sort of bearer digital instrument, because a government is going to want to control the monetary policy, and you're going to be able to have as many competing currencies as you want. So you can imagine a country someday sort of backing a particular digital currency with their own currency or tying it in some way. That would be interesting, but it's a long way in the future, I would say.
This is a niche thing, but I think it gets at what you're talking about, which is some state-sponsored some way. The Postal Service Inspector General a few months ago, and I'm sure you guys all subscribe to their newsletters, but actually developed a report looking at sort of, the Postal Service is broke, and they're trying to figure out how to not be broke. And one of the ideas is in some way using digital currency as a business in some way. But they also explore the idea of developing a post coin. And I'm not an expert in postal policy, but internationally, there are these international clearinghouses where if you send something to Paris, the Postal Service in the United States has to settle up with the Postal Service in France to pay for that last mile of delivery. They think there's a lot of promise to have an international post coin because these clearinghouses take a long time to sort of settle up, and it's kind of a clunky payment rail process. So they're seriously exploring, or at least have thought about it at this point, about developing a digital currency specific to postal services. I could see that if the postal services across the world have that problem, I'm sure there are other niche businesses that could also perhaps use digital payment rails in a similar way. Maybe that's how it develops, and I don't know, but that's a specific thing that I know at least has been explored in the United States so far.
I would just say that Bitcoin, the protocol itself, could allow for something like that to happen. The post office could ride above it on a layer, but also what you may have heard about are these things called altcoins. And so I'll just talk about that for a quick second, because an altcoin, most common now, like you may have heard of Kanye coin, which was like Kanye West that got shut down, or Dogecoin or Doggy coin or Litecoin. And what a lot of people have done, because Bitcoin is an open source protocol, other programming genius people in wherever they may be in the world, have taken that protocol and made slight tweaks to it and then released it and let other people access it and try to run with it. So I think that one of the geniuses of open source software and Bitcoin in general is that you can make tweaks, throw it out to the market, and people can take it or not. Bitcoin has been the first mover. It has sort of flaws to it, but those can be fixed. And I think there's a lot of innovation that will happen. I mean, it's crazy to me that the system we use for moving money around is hundreds of years old. Checking accounts, ledgers, those kind of things. I mean, we're in the 22nd century, whatever century, 2014, and we're using a system that's been around for hundreds of years. I mean, we need to advance that system, and Bitcoin is the internet of money, or at least what it hopes to be the internet of money.
I was just going to add, I agree with everything that's been said. To try to go along with the hypothetical a little bit, if the U.S. government were to support a new cryptocurrency that was decentralized but yet backed by the dollar, such that it would be stable valued and essentially pegged to the dollar, I think that, and you could send money from point A to point B without a financial intermediary, I think that would be revolutionary, amazing, and that the value of Bitcoin would quickly plummet because there would be little reason to use it. That's sort of, I'm going out on a limb here, but I think that supports what my colleagues are saying, which is that the development of altcoins, these other similar technologies, but that build upon Bitcoin in various ways are very, very important. Some innovation is going to happen within Bitcoin, some of it's going to happen within other similar technologies.
So not to just push back a tiny bit, simply that I can see that too, right? So this is what Canada tried to do with Midship, right? Is exactly that, and I can see the U.S. government eventually doing that. But I don't think that they would create a cryptocurrency.
I agree.
You agree?
Yeah.
So because with a cryptocurrency, basically you bake into the algorithm monetary policy and then you set it free, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to alter the monetary policy. And a government like the United States probably is not going to want to give up that kind of control.
I think, so I agree with the premise that it's very unlikely that you'd have a government create a cryptocurrency that looks like Bitcoin, but I think it's possible to build one that doesn't have the same restrictions on supply. I think you could have it work in the way it does, except that supply is connected to a group of people at the Federal Reserve.
And just so everyone knows, Bitcoin is limited to 21 million Bitcoins ever. So the way the mining works is, and the way Bitcoins are created is miners solve these problems, and as a reward, they get Bitcoins. Right now, I think it's 25 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. And in solving that problem, they're supporting the network that tells people what transactions have occurred. So it's a virtuous circle between the creation and Bitcoin, which is why it's grown and become so powerful. But it's limited to 21 million Bitcoins. Now that can go down 8 decimal points. So that's actually gazillions of Bitcoins potentially. But that's a limit, and the US dollar doesn't have that limit. Treasury can just print dollars all day, and we're all stuck. Not that I mind it, because I like the US dollar. We're all stuck with that though, because the only way we can pay our taxes, the only money that the government's going to honor is US dollars. So the US dollar is not going away. I think most people view Bitcoin as an alternative currency, a way that can complement sort of restrictions that we have with our current currency, and it can build different things on top of it.
I thought I'd throw out one fun thing that you can look up is look up Aurora Coin on the internet. And this involves Iceland, which is a fascinating case because as a result of the financial crisis, Iceland has really tough capital controls. And because Bitcoin is a way to move value outside the current system of capital movement, the Icelandic government has been, not surprisingly, very, very hostile to Bitcoin. So at one point, some cryptocurrency enthusiasts, we don't know quite who it was, were planning an airdrop, I'm not making this up, an airdrop of paper into Ireland with the various computer codes necessary to unleash the value of Aurora Coin so they could smash the shackles of fiat currency for the citizens of Iceland. It's the precise reverse case of what the questioner asked about, but it tells you something about where governments come from on this. We had a lot of questions. Let's see, I saw you first in the back there with the...
Me?
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. I have 4 questions. You could take or ignore any of them. They concern, well, I'll just rattle them off. They concern cybersecurity, anti-fraud regulation, and AML. Regarding cybersecurity, I was wondering if you think the private sector is sufficiently incentivized to prevent the types of huge hacks and cybersecurity risks we've seen. Regarding anti-fraud, do you think that the multi-party approval option or other parts of the Bitcoin algorithm that evolves by community consensus could be marshaled to solve some of the anti-fraud problems? Regarding regulation, to what extent are currency and country-specific regulatory efforts sort of whack-a-mole, where use will just move to the path of least resistance, like less regulated countries or any of the other 190 plus virtual currencies? And regarding AML, do decentralized anonymizing processes like CoinJoin mean Bitcoin will always be perfect for people who want to launder money?
Maybe we could group those, and I'm going to be an assignment editor here. Maybe Reuben and Jerry? No?
I want to do the cybersecurity one.
Okay.
I want to do the whack-a-mole one.
Reuben and Jerry, take a swing at the group. Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to respond to the whack-a-mole question, which I think is great series of questions. So there are a lot of countries right now where there's really no regulation on Bitcoin, and you would think that everyone would move there. And in certain cases, you're right. So a lot of exchanges are established abroad. If you look at where their main legal entities are housed, it's Nicaragua or Slovakia or something like that. But I think those institutions very, very quickly realize that by putting themselves in these random countries that no one thinks has effective enforcement mechanisms, not to pick on those 2 in particular, I didn't mean those in particular, but it becomes very difficult for them to raise capital and to build trust with their customers. And so you're actually seeing an enormous amount of investment in Bitcoin businesses in the US, and I think a repatriation of some Bitcoin-related money and businesses to the US, in part because the regulation that I think is coming very soon here is going to be smart and responsive, and is going to help build trust. I think this is sort of a paradox in that people in the Bitcoin world, on the one hand, don't want regulation. On the other hand, we want it because we want clarity. It's tough to balance and find what's the right set of regulation. But I think everyone agrees that if you achieve this balance, it'll be very, very good. You'll get trust from your customers. You'll have good relationships with the regulators. It'll be ultimately great for everybody.
So on the cybersecurity question, we've seen many security issues related to Bitcoin. So a lot of Bitcoin stolen, especially from exchanges that then go out of business. I think what's important to understand is that there's nothing inherently insecure about Bitcoin itself, the protocol, the system, the network. To the contrary, Bitcoin is incredibly secure in the sense that it is impossible to counterfeit a Bitcoin. Unlike the way it's easy, or not easy, but it's not difficult to counterfeit a US dollar. So so Bitcoin actually is very secure when it comes to the units and the transfer of the units. That's basically perfectly secure. Watch tomorrow, we'll have a breakthrough in cryptography and it'll all help. Yeah, so that said, what all of the security problems we have with Bitcoin are basic cybersecurity problems, meaning the issue is not with Bitcoin, the issue is with computer security. If your computer, your network is insecure, and I can break into your network, I can steal your Bitcoin, right? So that's not about Bitcoin being insecure, it's about your network being insecure. And I think what Bitcoin does is that what it's doing is it's putting is creating an incredible incentive for people to try to break into networks. And we've had hacking for a very long time, and we've had cybersecurity concerns for a very long time. But what do hackers normally steal? Or before Bitcoin, what could they have stolen? Well, they could have stolen IP, in which case, okay, now you have the IP. If you're China, maybe you can pass it along to corporations that are associated with the state to make use of it, okay? Or if you are a more pedestrian hacker, if you're the Russian mafia, maybe you could steal credit card numbers. And then what do you do with those? Well, you have to fence those, or you have to utilize them yourself to buy goods, or to otherwise, get money out of them. So it's very intermediated. with Bitcoin, once you break into the computer and you grab the Bitcoin, you have them. You have cash. And so what this is doing is it's creating a great incentive to break into computers. And to answer your question, I think it is equally creating an incentive to secure computers. Because if you have your computer broken into, you're going to lose money, right? It's not sort of a tertiary loss that you're going to have. You're going to literally lose the money. So it's just amping up the arms race that we've already seen for a very long time.
So I just want to push back very, very quickly. I just want to say almost every single exchange and wallet provider has been hacked, and people have had their money stolen. And I'm pro Bitcoin, but I think we need to be really honest, and I think that should give you an indication of what incentives are and are not enough. I don't think they're enough. I think regulators have to come in and play a role here.
I think that, just to counter that point or add on to it, when you're holding money, people are going to try to take it. People try to rob banks, people try to do other things, armored cars, whatever. Bitcoin is money, or a property that you can use to convert quickly to money. I mean, the same week you had Mt. Gox meltdown, and there was a huge investor loss or exchange customer loss, allegedly, and it's a little unclear. Citibank lost $400 million in Mexico. I mean, these problems are not unique to Bitcoin. It just happens to be a new way for criminals to take money, potentially. And it's problems that banks have struggled with for hundreds of years. How do you secure people's money? There's been a lot of innovation in this space, and there's a lot of funding going into that. One of the largest funded Bitcoin companies of recent note is Zappos, and they got, I think, $20 million from very esteemed venture capitalists to set up secure vaults for people's Bitcoin holdings. So where there's a problem, there's a solution that people are trying to work on.
So the next hand I saw was Steve right here, and then you, and then, okay, let's try to move around here.
Touching on something that Reuben and Brian said, I think the IRS would very quickly lose interest in Bitcoin if it was dollar coin and there were no profits to be made. And the question is, if you trade currencies, actually you're supposed to pay taxes if you make a profit. It's not like currencies don't get taxed, or currency trading doesn't get taxed. So, again, I'd suggest that, if NYU law graduates didn't get taxed, it would be very popular in the room, but it would distort the market. Why should Bitcoin, when you make profit on it, be different? Or how would you have the IRS tax your profits on Bitcoin?
There's no de minimis exception, which there is with foreign currency. So when you and I travel abroad and buy some euros, and maybe it appreciates or maybe it doesn't, no one's calculating that and paying tax on it on a de minimis level. And I think the biggest problem here is, again, there's a lack of engagement with the community about what Bitcoin is, and that's not what the IRS did. For example, just to relate it to FinCEN, FinCEN issued guidance, but it didn't anticipate really what mining was, and it didn't really understand it. And so they had to change their guidance at the end of last year and offer sort of clarity. And when you have a government regulator who just comes in, issues broad sweeping guidance 3 weeks before taxes are due without consulting with anybody in the community or any of the major players, that just smacks of heavy-handedness, and it smacks of you're going to have dumb regulation. And I think that can stifle innovation. I mean, when we had the internet at first, there was an internet, you'll know more about this, John, but I think there was an internet sort of tax-free. Internet sales were allowed to be largely tax-free on a federal level because Congress decided that we want to allow this innovation to occur. And so, yes, the tax man is always going to get his or her due, but when we're at 1994, or we're in 2014 with Bitcoin, it makes sense to move slowly but intelligently in terms of when you put down sort of broad sweeping regulation. And I'd be curious John's take on this. He probably can't say anything officially, but.
Let me just say quickly that I don't think anybody is making the case that profits in Bitcoin should not be taxed. I think if you buy something online and you owe sales tax, you need to pay that sales tax. And in fact, today, merchant processors that accept Bitcoin collect that sales tax and remit it. Okay, if you are accepting your salary in Bitcoin, as some people do, or if you're a miner and you have your basic income in Bitcoin, you owe income tax, ordinary income tax on that, and today people pay that. And if you buy Bitcoin and hold it, and you realize a gain, you need to pay, tax on that gain. The question simply is Bitcoin property or is it currency? And it has to be one of those two. And the IRS chose property, which I think probably was the correct decision, simply because Bitcoin's characteristics look more like property. And as a result, as you mentioned, if it had been classified as currency, you would still owe taxes on any gains. What's different between property and currency are the rates, and also this de minimis exemption, which is very important. I think that's the key. With property, there is no de minimis exemptions. For every cup of coffee, if I buy $1 cup of coffee and the Bitcoin that I used to pay that I bought at 75 cents, I have to report 25 cents worth of gain. And that's something that with currency we don't do. And maybe we need to have Congress address this, because Congress is the only one who can really address it.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. So let me and I'm going to push back a little bit and just kind of walk you through sort of where the IRS guidance came from. So about 3 years ago, roughly, the chair and ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, which is Congress, the Senate's committee that deals with tax issues, asked the Government Accountability Office, which is Congress's auditing arm, to take a look at virtual currencies and tax implications. And that was everything from Bitcoin to World of Warcraft dollars to the whole sort of spectrum of digital currencies writ large. And the GAO came back and said, IRS has some stuff on this, but not really, and they need to develop it. And IRS said, okay. And what GAO said specifically to them is to put it within the context of current law. So what IRS did, and again, it's something that it's pretty new still. We're still trying to kind of wrap our hands around it, what it actually means. But what they said, they had two choices, either property or currency. And currency for tax purposes is very specific. It's legal tender, and Bitcoin is not. You can't pay taxes with Bitcoin. It's not good for all debts, public and private, which is on all of your dollar bills. So the way they had to put it in the category of current law, their current authorities, is as property, as essentially virtual gold. In the same way that as I understand it, they view it as if I were buying a cup of coffee with a gold ingot, which maybe Starbucks will take, probably not. But obviously people don't buy things with gold ingots. So, but they have certain authorities that we as Congress have given them throughout time, and they had certain choice to make. What the role of Congress at this point is, and frankly the role of the public and industry and folks like the folks that are up here at this panel, the FinCEN guidance after a time was based in large part on e-gold, which was a digital currency, not decentralized, but had a lot of legal troubles years ago, and much of the FinCEN guidance was based on that and then applied to Bitcoin. It wasn't a great fit in some ways, and it has been refined after the fact. I would expect, and my understanding from IRS is they are taking meetings with folks and taking comments, and they're listening to folks in industry, and I would be very surprised if you don't see further clarifications down the road and further refinements. But again, as we sort of observe either the IRS guidance or any other regulatory agency that comes down the pike with their thoughts on this, Congress is going to have to take a look, and these agencies are going to have to tell us if they need additional authorities or additional definitions in order to deal with virtual currency as a payment rail, which is how a lot of folks think it could be valuable.
Let's get to our very patient questioner right here. You had your hand up.
My question was just asked.
Your question was just asked. Okay, let's move around the room. Yes. Could you speak up, please?
I practiced tax law for more than 5 or 6 years, and I'm interested in the most current financial product, and I'm wondering whether so there's two options for the tax treatment of a Bitcoin. One is property, one is currency, and I guess there's consensus that it cannot be treated as a currency. Then my question is whether the treatment of a property is a right tax treatment. So I want to ask the panels about their opinion of, about treating Bitcoin as derivatives or securities instead of property.
Ask you as a practicing tax lawyer, have you had anyone come to you saying, I've got these Bitcoin, what do I do?
Sorry. I used to practice tax law back in Korea and also in the US, but I'm no longer practicing tax law because I'm a PhD student right now, so sorry about that.
Why don't I briefly answer derivatives and maybe you can answer securities?
I'm not really a tax person, but
Oh, you mean treating it for tax purposes as a derivative?
Yeah, I just, just
I'm not a tax attorney.
broad question.
I don't think any of us.
I think you may have practiced tax law longer than anyone else on this panel. So if you want to answer the question, please go ahead.
Yeah, treating it as a property is, as a general matter, is a right approach. But since this is based on the e-commerce or electronical environment, it's very hard to tax as a traditional property, and that's why I'm asking whether it should be treated as a, kind of quasi-securities or quasi-derivatives. I understand that, both, derivatives or securities are not perfect treatment for the Bitcoin. I understand that, but since property, I think that property is not also perfect, treatment, I wonder, how you're thinking about this.
So this is way outside my comfort zone. I'm not a tax lawyer, but I would say I think it'll be interesting to see what responses the Bitcoin technology community comes up with. I think you'll find wallet providers and merchant payment processors to start baking in, we'll take care of your tax problems for you. The other thing I want to bring up is part of the idea of, I think, the way this works now is you have to track your, you sort of have two options for, if it's property for paying taxes. One is you track your bases. So on the basis of, I've spent a particular Bitcoin, I bought that Bitcoin at that time, at this exchange, at this rate, and I know exactly what I bought it for. The alternative is to use, I guess it's LIFO or FIFO, I don't remember which it is, and apparently there's a very similar approaches used for securities where, you can buy, there's dividends that you get at a bunch of different, prices, and so, at the point which you sell it, you have to somehow either tie it back in a particular way or use one of these mechanisms of FIFO or LIFO. So I would analogize to that. Like I said, I'm way outside my comfort zone here, but I think this is something that the enterprising law students and law professors here who are more expert in tax could really help out here with.
You have a niche there. Open the business. Okay, well, keep going. The gentleman, sort of reddish sweater. Just yell. I'll repeat if we need to.
Oh, there it is. So I've heard somewhat mixed signals today about regulatability. And my question is essentially, if what we're talking about is a system that is a protocol, that's a basis on which any user can innovate and create intermediaries that are somewhat autonomous, that function because of the community rather than because a corporation has propped them up as the way to do the thing. So Jerry, you mentioned the prediction market. If we were to really make these innovative tools, as the open source community has made a lot of software that's become fundamental to the internet, does that speak to the regulability question determinatively? It seems like you could regulate, but it'd be something like what copyright has turned into, wherein you're criminalizing mass behavior, and compliance becomes a non-starter on a certain level.
I think that's exactly the right analogy, right? So if you think about BitTorrent being sort of the successor to Napster, Napster was centralized. As a result, you could shut it down. BitTorrent is decentralized, so you can't shut it down. But there's still, in the world of BitTorrent, there's still going to be intermediaries, so you still need to find the magnet file or the BitTorrent file, and so there'll be websites that host these, and so can you regulate these websites? Okay, maybe we decentralize websites, maybe you decentralize those. And so I think this is ultimately always going to be a cat and mouse game. But I think you're right. I think ultimately it's going to be, so take prediction markets. you can imagine a world where it is a lot like prohibition. And I think that file sharing has been compared to alcohol prohibition, and eventually what happened with alcohol prohibition, it was normalized. With file sharing, we're seeing not exactly normalization, but we're seeing what we saw was that the record industry or the entertainment industry began to deal with it as a fact in the world rather than try to fight it. So perhaps we might see a future where prediction markets become a fact in the world, and so the choice becomes: do we want to normalize this and treat it in a sane way?
Let me throw something out to think about in this context. One thing I've noticed in covering Bitcoin is because it's not just a technology, it's a currency and money, is you can run these fantastic thought experiments, fill an evening thinking about what you could do with Bitcoin, and imagine yourself in a world where everything is decentralized, there are no intermediaries, and on and on and on. And as a consequence of that, like the questioner did, question the regulatability of the entire system. But that system doesn't exist yet. And would that system exist except as a niche? I have my doubts. And one of the central reasons for that is it's going to take a lot of money to operationalize the Bitcoin protocol as an effective payment system, as an effective payment method, the whole kit and caboodle. And the money that wants to get into that is not interested in, they're innovative, but they invest with what the intention of what every venture capitalist invested is, namely exiting. They want to eventually have something that can be sold. And there'll be a fun moment in Bitcoin history, I'm convinced it's coming at some point, where a big bank buys some piece of technology that's part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and effectively, concedes defeat in one sense, but in another sense, that's the ultimate mainstreaming of Bitcoin. But those are the scenarios that people are looking at: building actual companies, registered companies, eventually listing them for an IPO or selling them. And these scenarios of something that's fun to think about in your mind, but is very hard to imagine in practice. I just be aware that that's what you tend to do. I've heard this conversation many times in evenings over drinks, and the more drinks, the crazier it gets.
But BitTorrent exists, right?
Yeah, and I don't think we should be so dismissive of.
BitTorrent is also, I would not call that a mainstream. Yeah.
But open source software exists mostly because of user innovation. A lot of these people don't even get paid for their work.
Sure.
And Apache runs the web, basically.
But, I just learned this today. Do you know how Apache came about? Was a whole bunch of the big tech companies put people on it, which is to say they were paying their salaries, and they put together Apache. They kicked in all sorts of intellectual property that was theirs for the purpose, because there was a collective interest in making Apache work. So to say that individuals just came together and threw this together in a decentralized fashion is not quite correct.
And the foundation funds the chief scientist, Gavin Andreessen, and funds a lot of the core developers of Bitcoin. So even in Bitcoin, some of the people who work on the protocol and sort of build the changes, the foundation supports a number of them and has them on salary. So I think, but again, like anything else, anyone else can suggest a change to the protocol, and maybe it gets adopted and maybe it doesn't. I would just say to Carter, your point, I don't think anyone here knows what the future is going to hold for Bitcoin, and I think I'm not dismissive, and I think those late night exercises over beer are not only fun, but I think 10 years from now when we have this talk, there'll be things done with Bitcoin and the protocol, or a protocol like Bitcoin, that none of us would have imagined in this room today. And it's maybe some kid in college who came up with it just on the fly for fun. When Google came out and they wanted to digitize every book in the world, or whatever, scan the whole world with maps so we can all go to Google Maps, those things sound crazy, and those are things kids would have bannered around in college, and now those things are happening. And I think, I'm a sort of a non-creative lawyer who likes to do criminal defense, and I'm not going to come up with those ideas. but there are people that will, and I think, you know, that's what excites me about this, is not what's happening today so much, but where it's going to be 10 years from now. And, you know, maybe I would say now still you shouldn't buy a Bitcoin unless you're willing to lose everything. But I think if you want to bet on the future and you're willing to take some risk, a Bitcoin is a decent bet. And I think it will be exciting to see what happens.
Next question. These two gentlemen have been waiting, so you and then you with the beard.
Yes. So my question is kind of related to Peter's. It's about the wisdom of regulating Bitcoins. We just heard that Bitcoin's the future. We don't know what it's going to hold. It's a really quickly changing technology, and it's kind of impossible to predict where it's going. So if that's the case, why do we want to regulate it at all? Because it strikes me that any regulation that happens right now in a couple years will most likely be wrong-headed because we don't know where it's going, or even worse, will create a path dependency for Bitcoin such that what might have been an optimal allocation is destroyed because of the regulation and we go to a suboptimal path. So how do you regulate in that context?
That's a great question. I think it means that regulators have to be really, really careful. You can imagine a couple of different ways to write Bitcoin-related regulation. One might be, I have in my mind, Coinbase, or I have in my mind Kraken, or whatever exchange, and here is what I think needs to happen on how they arrange their cold storage and how they deal with this problem and how they deal with that problem. The other end of the spectrum is saying, you need to deal with security reasonably, period. I think what you're going to find is responsible regulation is going to be somewhere in between, where on the one hand it actually prescribes some standards and gives people some comfort that people are doing things the right way, but on the other hand is not so clear cut and solidified that it's not going to be able to respond to changes in Bitcoin or to new cryptocurrencies that come down the pike. But it's a worry. I think it's hard to say what the right answer is here. Do we just wait another 10 years and see what happens? I mean, people have lost, however hundreds of millions of dollars in Mt. Gox. That worries me. And I think there's got to be some way that regulation can help there without killing innovation, without solidifying the innovation that's happening in the cryptocurrency space.
Here's something to chew on. The Bitcoin industry wants clear regulation. It's not as though the mainstream of the Bitcoin industry is saying, don't touch us at all. If you do anything, you will kill this thing in its cradle. Because the mainstream, the smart innovators and the venture capitalists understand that they need to have a certain degree of certainty going forward if they're ever going to sell these, build and sell these businesses. I have no doubt that in a couple of years' time, people will, FinCEN is probably going to update its guidance on Bitcoin and money laundering within the next year, so this stuff is going to happen. And it may be that there are a few false starts before, hit the right formula.
I just want to point out real quick, you should think critically when you hear people in the Bitcoin industry say we think regulation is good, in part because of who it's coming from, people who are very well funded, and it helps them sometimes once they've figured out the lay of the land, they've got the money, they're already running for regulations to be written for them and create high barriers to entry for others. So, something to keep in mind.
Like the barriers to entry to law.
Yeah, and if I could just add real quickly, Jeremy Allaire, who's the CEO, founder of Circle Internet Financial, testified at our hearing, and he said something that has stuck with me. He said, it's one thing for a kid to sit in his garage and develop a photo sharing app and not feel like the government needs to come in and regulate it. It's a very different thing to create financial products or financial institutions, which is what we're talking about here. So, there do need to be some rules of the road, and for folks who, as Carter just said, who want it to become mainstream, the average consumer, I can't remember, I remember distinctly when we first got America Online, how long it took my mother to buy something on the internet, because she was like, so I'm going to send my credit card number through our telephone to who? Who's going to see it? And if you want consumers to actually be a part of this, be a part of whatever financial products or services come laid on top of this protocol or a protocol like it, they're going to need to feel some security or confidence.
And Bitcoin companies need banking. It's one of the biggest problems for any Bitcoin company is If you go in your bank and say, I'm going to open a Bitcoin company, give me a bank account, they'll say, no way. Unless you have like a very powerful venture capitalist who's funding. Yeah. So FinCEN guidance lent credibility. The IRS guidance, despite its flaws or apparent flaws, lends more credibility to Bitcoin and what's happening here. That's why we're here. I mean, it's becoming more and more part of the mainstream. I think what everyone on this panel wants is smart regulation, and that's always hard to figure out. And smart regulation means one thing to one person and one thing to another, but everyone's in favor of innovation, so regulation that allows innovation, but regulation that also protects people and makes sure that terrorists aren't using this to fund their illicit activities. So it's just finding that on that spectrum.
So, yes, sir.
Thank you all for coming out. I think it's wonderful to hear your perspectives on this. So I work here at NYU with Just Security, which is a national security blog. And we've been very interested, and hopefully we'll be putting up some coverage looking at how possible it might be for Bitcoin really to be used in a very serious way to move a lot of money out of the country. I'm still getting a handle on the technical details, but one of the questions that I have for you is looking at the ways in which Bitcoin is not anonymous but is pseudonymous. How much do you think regulation can and should interact with the blockchain to try and understand where money's coming from? And in your estimation, do you think it is possible to do some aggregate analysis to ease some of the problems that people are really afraid of? I know at the hearing in Washington, everybody was sort of talking about this risk of really all the money is going to flee to all the terrorists everywhere. And as much as I think that's an exaggeration, being somebody who does look at this issue, I am really concerned, and I'm curious how much you are.
So I think, a few things. I mean, law enforcement is concerned about Bitcoin. Right now, again, we need to understand sort of how nascent this technology is and how small the market cap is. There's a lot of ways for organized criminals and other folks that want to move large amounts of money across the world to do so, and they do it. So law enforcement feels, now having said that, the blockchain, I would be very surprised, and there's been independent academics, Sarah Michaeljohn from the University of California, San Diego, student out there, wrote a paper. We've spoken to her several times, and she did a lot of work to map the blockchain. I would be very surprised if there are not people in the United States government that have done similar things. So, right now, the potential to move large amounts of money, there really isn't, because there's not really large amounts of money in the large scheme of things to do so. But law enforcement is definitely a concern and remains very vigilant. And as this, as a part of the larger cybersecurity buildup, as crime moves to the web more and more, I just think that the tools or resources that they need to deal with it, whether it's mapping or whatever, will, I think, be a part of that larger effort. So it's something that, again, at this point isn't there, but I think law enforcement is vigilant in the future.
Let me just throw something in here. I was an editor at Bloomberg, walked over and handed me a paper in which somebody had found as many public Bitcoin addresses as they could, and essentially reverse engineered the pseudonyms and said, because people like Jerry occasionally throw a Bitcoin address out there in public so you can associate a name with it. A lot of people do this, and so you can reverse engineer and make it entirely anonymous, know exactly who's doing what. And I mention this only because the editor who walked over and gave me this paper is a longtime writer and editor in the intelligence sphere. So I don't think this, and Bitcoin would not normally come up on his radar unless somebody had sort of steered him to that. So yes, people are thinking about this. You should also be in touch with the Atlantic Council in Washington. They're doing some sort of event. I think it's later this week or next. But that was the first time that I noticed that some sort of geopolitical, geostrategic, foreign policy people who don't normally think about something as mundane as economics started taking up the idea of Bitcoin. It may be because the director of the Atlantic Council, is a former editor of the Wall Street Journal.
At DARPA, I know, sort of sponsored a contest, like a grant contest to de-anonymize the blockchain. So DARPA has been looking at it. Google is, as Carter's sort of pointing out, is your probably the easiest way to de-anonymize the blockchain. You type in, you basically paste in a Bitcoin address that you're curious about, and probably 1 out of 4 times you're going to get back a name. And this is also where Know Your Customer comes in, right? This is what the Bank Secrecy Act is supposed to address. So I personally use Coinbase as the wallet and sort of exchange service that I use, and Coinbase knows who I am, and so if there's ever a subpoena that needs to happen, Coinbase will turn over that information. And also, the more information you have through KYC about Bitcoin addresses, the easier the Meiklejohn type analysis becomes. So I think probably the bigger challenge for governments are capital controls, where what you're really looking to do is get the money out of the country. And so this is why countries like Iceland are very hostile to Bitcoin, and China is sort of ambivalent to potentially hostile, because they're not so much concerned about the identity of the person, they're concerned about just not having money leave the country.
The gentleman on my left is going to get the last question.
Thanks. I've heard a lot of advocacy of regulation for creating consumer confidence, and I was wondering if we might want to look at the history of the origin of financial markets in Amsterdam, in London, in New York, the past 400 years, and looking at those as self-regulatory organizations. So the London Stock Exchange created as their motto, "My word is my bond." The New York Stock Exchange, similar history as a private club. So all of these people were equivalent of working in their mother's garage, but it was private regulation rather than government regulations.
Well, there is movement out there for, SROs. There's a group called Data that's meeting this week. I think it's this week, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, this week in Washington, and it's for digital currency self-regulatory organization. I think you will see that as a general direction. I think responsible players in the industry do want to set up ways to police themselves and build trust and credibility. Those kind of things can only work so well and go so far. But I think that is something that you will see more of with digital currencies and Bitcoin in general. And I think people are generally supportive of those ideas.
I just want to say a couple things in response. One is in the U.S., if you are not you don't have the support of a regulator, it's almost impossible to build up something called a self-regulatory organization without running afoul of antitrust laws. So that's something that you have to think about. The next is, I guess what you're wondering is, first of all, how long are we willing to wait for regulation for people to build up things that are effective? Is 1 Mt. Gox enough? Is it 2? Is it 10? The other side of it may be, well, we think that regulation brought on by regulators, by government, is actually going to be less effective than what the community is going to come up with on its own. I think that's an important conversation to have. I'm not sure. I think it's time.
I'll just throw out something. It's not technically self-regulation, but the way industry associations encourage best practices. This is something that industry often goes to regulators to and say, we're going to ensure that we follow these rules for self-impose these rules for consumer protection and so on and so forth. And it's typically these come up in situations where the government is contemplating regulation and the industry is trying to push back. In the case of Bitcoin, it's coming up because I think there is a genuine desire to create good actors that the public can trust. The problem that they have run into, and I've covered this in other industries, is they are consistently unwilling to actually throw out the bad actors within the ecosystem. It's very hard for an industry to police itself. And you brought up the New York Stock Exchange. I suspect National City Bank was a member of the New York Stock Exchange in the 20s and early 30s with the onset of the Great Depression. And we know all sorts of bad things that they did as a result of the subsequent investigations. So, these private collections, they definitely work, and they definitely encourage certain practices, but they don't have a great track record of policing themselves, at least in my experience covering them individually.
So I'll just throw this out for fun.
Yeah.
Something fun that Bitcoin sort of gives us a peek into is the possibility of algorithmic regulation, where a lot of the sort of justification for regulation is to make sure that the counterparties are trustworthy, right? With Bitcoin or with blockchain technologies, you could create contracts that are provably fair and provably execute. And so you can imagine a decentralized exchange of some kind, of stock exchange or something, or a derivatives exchange, where you can prove mathematically that all of the transactions have happened, to reconcile, and that they have been fair, and that everybody's handed over what they said they were going to hand over. And so a lot of the justification for regulation goes away there. So I mean, it's a fun thought, over beer's thought experiment.
We don't want to throw John out of a job, though, and other people in the government. So
yeah, I don't want to get it replaced with a drone or whatever we're talking about here. No, I think, just real quick, I think there's a lot of ways to cut the cake. I think a CRO that presents a plan and has legitimate actors in the private sector, and perhaps with oversight from Congress and some industry players as well, that could be a way that maybe buys us a few years to see how this matures or doesn't mature. There's other ways to do it too, but I think it'll just be who kind of comes to the table and if they're perceived to be legitimate.
All right, I don't want to get the stink eye from the organizers, so I'll say thank you very much to our panelists. This is a great collection of knowledge here about Bitcoin of many facets. Read the primers, read up. There's much to learn.